Good afternoon. I'm Victoria Gonen from the Office of Alumni Relations, and we're pleased to welcome you and glad that you can join us today to learn more about Paris in the age of revolution. Your feedback is incredibly important to us, so we'd like you to share your thoughts afterwards. You will receive a survey, an electronic survey. So after this session, we'd love your feedback. I'm honored to introduce our presenter today, Professor Katie Hornstein. Katie received her PhD in art history from the University of Michigan in 2010 and has been teaching at Dartmouth for the past 2 years. She's a specialist of the 19th century French art and visual culture and teaches courses at Dartmouth on modern European history as well as the history of photography. Her current book focuses on the relationship between visual representation of war, emergent modes of visual production across a range of media, and structures of political power from the French Revolution through the Crimean War from 1789 to 1856. Professor Hornstein's work has been recognized in the form of fellowships and awards from the Fulbright Commission, the American Council of Learned Societies, and the Samuel H. Crest Foundation. Let's give a warm welcome to Professor Hornstein as she tells us why there's more to French art than Impressionism.
Thank you very much for that very generous introduction. So I'm very happy to be here today to talk to you about some work that is really the art that is responsible for me falling in love with art history. And so I was initially asked to speak about Impressionism, and I was like, no. I want to speak about Jericho, because I think that Jericho is where it's at. So that's what this talk is going to be about today. I'm going to bring you into the rich context of this period, which is so interesting and so kind of divisive. And to try to understand what Jericho was doing with this incredible painting that I'm going to speak to you about today, a painting called the Raft of the Medusa. So without further ado, I'm going to get us into some rich historical context. Can everybody hear me? Yep. Yeah? Wonderful. Some rich historical context that you need to understand in order to really appreciate what Jericho was doing. And of course, the reason why I study France in the 19th century, the reason why I'm so fascinated by it, is because of all of the political upheaval that happens in the period in the 19th century and right before it. And so I thought I would bring you in this timeline to sort of to clarify this for you. And I show you here a painting, a very important painting by a French painter named Rigaud, who was an official court painter to Louis XIV. This is, of course, a picture that predates the period that we're going to be speaking about today. It's a fairly large painting. It is meant to be imposing. And of course, Louis XIV he was a very accomplished ballet dancer. And he's here in his ballet costume in a ballet pose. And this was the way that the king would demonstrate his prowess. That might seem a little silly to us today, but this is how they rolled in the beginning of the 18th century. So Louis XIV, I bring him into you because I just wanted to establish the fact that this is the age. What I show you here is a picture that represents the age of absolutism. Louis XIV was the longest reigning French monarch, 72 years. And then, of course, I have a timeline, Louis XV, and then we have poor, unfortunate Louis XVI, who ascends to the throne in 1774, and his reign ends in 1792 during the French Revolution. We say that the French Revolution starts with 1789 and the Bastille fortress being stormed by the revolutionaries. But a lot of historians would also argue that the French Revolution was a long time coming, that France was getting internally destabilized, that the monarchy was already having a lot of financial problems, for example, that France was having a lot of trouble feeding its population, and that there was a kind of merchant class that was getting really restless under the monarchy. And this is not a lecture about the French Revolution, but I could go on. I must stop myself because I have to get to Jericho. So the French monarchy is officially abolished in September of 1792. Louis XVI is executed in January of 1793, followed by Marie Antoinette in October of 1793, and I will show you some imagery today from the French Revolution, which is so fascinating, and I think you'll really be interested in it. And the rest of this timeline is to just show you how much tribulation politically there is in France at this time. It is literally, the 19th century is an incredible time in French history because what you have are regimes that are just constantly being overturned by revolution. 1789, 1815 is the fall of Napoleon Bonaparte, the second fall of Napoleon Bonaparte at Waterloo. 1830, there's a revolution. 1848, there are two revolutions. And 1871 is another revolution. And this is all what precedes Impressionism, right? Impressionism is a movement that starts in the 1870s. So this is in many ways the background to that. Now, to understand the painting that I'm going to be talking to you about today, The Raft of the Medusa by Jericho, we have to first understand what a history painting is. This is a very important category of painting in France, and it is a very specific category. It is at the top of the so-called hierarchy of genres, right? There's different genres of painting, with history painting being at the absolute top of the hierarchy, followed by portraiture, landscape, still life, right? These sorts of they're known as lower genres. History painting is at the top of this hierarchy of genres because it contains all other genres. If you look at this painting by Poussin, who is one of the most important French history painters during the age of Louis XIV, we have portraiture, we have architectural painting, and we have, most importantly, the representation of an event in history, an event that is not contemporary, but an event that is, in this case, ancient. History painting was reserved for ancient subjects, for mythological subjects, for religious subjects. History painting was meant to inspire and morally elevate. It was not about the here and now. It was about eternal values that were meant to transport you. You were supposed to kind of transcend history with a history painting, to elevate you. And I have these great quotes by Poussin and Le Fonsanienne talking about the so-called grand manner. And this is Poussin, the quote I have on the bottom, talking about what the grand manner is. And by grand manner, he means history painting. The grand manner consists of four things: subject matter or theme, thought, structure, and style. The subject matter shall be grand, as are battles, heroic actions, and divine things. Keep away from minutiae and paint only things magnificent and grand. So these are some very lofty goals for a genre of painting. And this is something we have to keep in mind. Painters, if you wanted to make it as a painter in France, you had to make a history painting. This was the way that you established your career. So it was extremely important to people. The other thing we have to know about history painting is that it was big. Scale is very, very important to history paintings. The other thing that's really important about history paintings is their public display. History paintings, like Poussin's Death of Germanicus, was intended to be displayed to the public in the so-called salon exhibitions. The salon exhibitions at this time were only intended for artists who were members of the official French Art Academy. If you were not a member of this academy, you could not show your work. So this is how the Academy, the French Academy, which by the way is founded in 1648 under Louis XIV, this is how the French Art Academy polices itself, right? It only lets in painters that are following its rules. And it can, prevent painters who want to break the rules from entering. And the reason why I wanted to talk to you about Jericho today is because he's one of the first French artists who really, truly decides to break rules, right? He really breaks ranks with the Academy. And of course, the sort of subtitle of my lecture, there's more to art than Impressionism. The Impressionists are also very famous rule breakers. That's why we're so interested in them. And I'm showing you here an engraving from the Salon of 1785, and you'll see that the hierarchy of genres that I was talking about earlier is actually on display in this engraving. And what you see here, these are the history paintings. And the history paintings, believe it or not, this is the pride of place in this exhibition, which, by the way, also happens in the Louvre, the Louvre Museum that still exists today. History paintings are hung at the top, because you were supposed to look up and contemplate them, right? It was supposed to elevate you morally, so they get pride of place hanging on top. Portraits, still life, landscape at the bottom, right? So the hang of the Salon represents the hierarchy of genres. And I'm showing you a painting. There's a painting in here that's a really important painting that I'm going to show you. This right here, a very famous painting by a French neoclassical painter named Jacques-Louis David called The Oath of the Horatii. I'm going to talk a little bit about Jacques-Louis David because it would be impossible to talk about Jericho without talking about David. David was a member of the French Art Academy. He was very precocious. He was full of ambition. He, like other members of the young students who wanted to become history painters, full of ambition, had to first begin his studies in the French Art Academy with a master. And one of the first things you learn how to do if you're an artist that wants to make it as a history painter in France in the 18th and early 19th century is that you have to learn how to draw the human body. But it's not just any human body that you need to learn how to draw. You first start by trying to emulate, by trying to copy ancient sculptures. First, you work off of plaster casts that would have been around, that would have been teaching tools. And then once you get really good at drawing reproductions of sculpture, then you get to draw after the live model, but only when you were good enough. And this is a very early, a so-called academy study of the male nude by Jacques-Louis David from 1764, and you can see that he has a little while to go, right? He hasn't quite perfected his study of anatomy yet. It's a little lumpy, this body. And I've underlined and italicized this right here, the word académie. This genre of drawing was so crucial to an artist's education in the 17th, 18th, and 19th century that it gets its own noun. We call these drawings of male nudes académies. And by the way, it's always male nudes, not female nudes, because the nude male body, which is conceived as an ancient, moral body, can only be male for these young artists and for the establishment artists. It's not a female body. That phenomenon doesn't really happen until the mid-19th century. And the Academy was such a powerful kind of container of moral virtue that it was a way station for a history painter. You had to be able to represent the body, and I'm showing you here a really lovely Academy by a French artist named Drouet, who was a student, who was a protege of Jacques-Louis David's. And also the fact that these works are really indebted to ancient sculpture, that they were looking to these ancient sculptures as models of emulation for their history paintings. The other reason I'm showing you this is because this sculpture, the Dying Gaul, is in the Capitoline Museum in Rome. And this allows me to talk to you guys a little bit about the fact that to be an artist at this time, if you wanted to make it as a history painter, you submitted to this competition that happened every year that the French Art Academy presided over. It was called the Prix de Rome, the Rome Prize. And if you won this competition as a history painter, you got to go to Rome for 4 years. And you got to go study in Rome. You got to go mostly study ancient after the ancients, but you also got to study Michelangelo as well as other Renaissance masters. And Drouet accompanied Jacques-Louis David to Rome after he won the Rome Prize, where Jacques-Louis David worked on this painting, which is The Oath of the Horatii, also based on an ancient Roman tale. Jacques-Louis David was told by the French government what part of this story he was supposed to represent. Jacques-Louis David did not follow those rules. He made up his own part of the story that did not exist in the original Roman tale of the Horatii. This, by the way, is a tale which is about the founding of Rome. Jacques-Louis David makes up his own part of the story, enlarges the painting beyond what the government had asked for, and sends it to the Paris Salon 2 weeks late, right? As a way of sort of marking out his own autonomy as an artist, to say, I am going to break with your prescriptions, with your rules. So this is 4 years before the French Revolution. In 1785, this is a painting which is interpreted by most critics, and by the way, there are critics who are writing for newspapers at this time, and the public, the reading public, the bourgeois reading public is reading these newspapers. Salon critics say very interesting things that art historians, in other words, Salon criticism is a great text for art historians to kind of go through. It allows us to check back in with the past to see how these pictures were read at the time that they were made. At the time that this picture is made in 1785, it's largely seen by critics as being a call to defend the monarchy, which is so fascinating. And this changes after 1789. It's seen as a call to abolish the monarchy, right, and join together in fraternité. So it's really interesting how the meaning of a painting can shift over time. Jacques-Louis David, in composing the Oath of the Horatii, of course, follows all the rules. Even though I just told you that he broke some of the rules, right, by sending it late, by enlarging it, by choosing a different moment in the story, he's also towing the line. He's towing the line with one-point perspective. Going back here, he's also towing the line in terms of the subject matter, being an ancient heroic tale, the separation of genders, the heroic sort of virile male oath-making which is going on here, and the sort of literally kind of crumbling ladies who cry in the corner, right? That opposition was very important for the painting because it allows it to tell the story. What we have here is we have a crystal clear story being told. The expectation of a history painting is that it tells you a story that is easily recognizable and easily readable. That's what a history painting was supposed to be. Jacques-Louis David also followed all the rules in terms of the way that he composed this painting. First he would start with studies, right, in a sketchbook, and we have these studies conserved. He would start with studies in a sketchbook to think about what part of the story he wanted to represent. And then once he had conceived the composition, he would draw each figure individually, fairly large scale. And then, as you guys can see, there's squares, right? He's put a grid on top of this figure study. And once he had that figure completely mapped out and completely sort of, worked out in his mind and on the paper, he transferred it to the painting. Right, so that the conception was rock solid before he painted it. That's how a history painting is composed until Jericho. Jacques-Louis David also had a studio system where he would train other aspiring history painters, and as you can see, this is a very serious space, a male-only space, where men are instructed in anatomy after the live model, some men drawing after ancient sculptures here, but it's a serious space of study. If you were a student in Jacques-Louis David's studio, you would have learned how to read ancient Greek, Latin. You would have been relatively fluid in terms of all of the classical tales that you were expected to know as a history painter, because that's what history painting was. This changes with the French Revolution. The French Revolution not only abolishes the French monarchy and the aristocracy and the Catholic Church and the regular Gregorian calendar, it also abolishes the French Art Academy. And Jacques-Louis David is the person that is behind the abolition of the French Art Academy because he does not like its rules. And of course, I bring you this incredible drawing that's attributed to another student of Jacques-Louis David's, a painter named Girodet, that is what we think to be an eyewitness drawing of the decapitation of the Intendant de Paris, the sort of the finance minister, and the person that was in charge of the Bastille prison. And this is Girodet, who is a history painter, who would at this point have been painting ancient, noble, moral subjects, taking stock of what is happening in the streets of Paris. This starts happening in 1789. So all of a sudden, painters have to start thinking about contemporary events. And contemporary events become so pressing and so troubled that they can't turn their eyes away from them. I bring you here one of my favorite objects from the French Revolution. This is at the Musée Carnavalet in Paris, which is the history museum of Paris. Toy guillotines made of ivory. These would have been objects that maybe you would have given to your children, right? So they could play guillotine. How do you deal with the violence of revolution, right? And this is just the tip of the iceberg. If you go to this museum, you will find all of these incredible objects that were made for people to deal with ongoing events, because guess what? Oil painting takes a really long time, right? So the media that come to represent the French Revolution, not oil painting. It's too much money and it takes too long. So you have really interesting objects like this. And then you also have prints, right? Prints, engravings are much faster than oil painting. And these are two of my favorite images from the French Revolution because they are so stark and so violent. And they really say a lot extremely efficiently. We have here, this is Louis the Traitor, read your sentence on the wall. This is a print that was produced right after Louis XVI was tried as for treason by the National Convention and found to be guilty and sentenced to be executed. This, of course, is the print that's made right after his execution. You know, these are bold, graphic statements about the violence of revolution. And of course, here we have a little depiction of the guillotine, whose nickname during the French Revolution was the National Razor. It's a great period. This is Jacques-Louis David thinking about revolution. Jacques-Louis David has a lot of trouble making history paintings during the French Revolution because events are changing so quickly. How do you deal with such radical change that's happening so quickly with, you know, people, politicians being accused of treason left and right, being executed? This is Marie Antoinette on her way to the scaffold, which is today stands at present-day Place de la Concorde in Paris. Jacques-Louis David probably saw Marie Antoinette as she passed in a hay wagon on her way to be executed. She had requested the right to ride in a carriage like her husband had been granted on the way to his execution, but the revolutionary government decided that she would ride out in the open to be visible to people on the streets. What I really love, this is a very small drawing. This drawing is probably about that small in real life. What I really love about this drawing is what I would call its economy of line. There are very few lines in this drawing. To me, what that indicates is that Jacques-Louis David made this very quickly, on the fly, as she had just gone by. What else strikes me about this drawing is her incredible posture. Despite the fact that her hair had been cut, that her false teeth had been taken out, that she was wearing no makeup, that she was dressed basically in linen, very simple dress, she maintains that carriage because she was raised as a princess. She didn't know any differently. I don't read it as a defiant gesture. It's just how she was, right? So this is what Jacques-Louis David does during the French Revolution. He struggles with history painting because he's not used to representing contemporary events. This is an attempt on the part of a history painter to deal with the execution of Louis XVI on an epic, monumental level using the language and the grammar of history painting. The reason why I'm showing you just a drawing is because it was never completed, because there was no money to finance history painting at this point, because the Academy had been abolished. And what happens next in France is, of course, the rise of Napoleon Bonaparte. And the war in France breaks out in 1792 because other governments monarchical governments around France are getting very nervous with what's happening in France in terms of the abolition of the monarchy. Then they start executing all the whole aristocracy as well as the king and the queen. So these governments such as Austria, Belgium were really nervous, and they declare war on the French revolutionary government. France defends itself, and this is the beginning of the French Revolutionary Wars, which eventually spiral into the Napoleonic Wars with the rise of Napoleon Bonaparte. And I show you this print. It's from 1797. I'm really fascinated by this print because it represents Napoleon Bonaparte and his generals literally refashioning the map of Europe, right, as though it's just a matter of tearing pieces of paper apart. And this is, of course, Bonaparte standing in the front with his other generals who were just as important at the time, by the way, standing in the background, holding smaller pieces of territory. Napoleon gets to hold Italy, which was the most illustrious piece of territory that he that he was the general that oversaw the battles that effectively annexed Italy to France in 1796. Bonaparte rises to power because he is the most ruthless general. He's really good at networking, and he's really good at PR. And you see that here. He really understood how to use images to his benefit. This is one reason why he is such an important person. This is one reason why he ascends to power. This is one way that Jacques-Louis David responds to contemporary events. I should also say that Jacques-Louis David was no friend of the monarchy. He was also a politician during the French Revolution. He, in fact, voted for the execution of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette. He is what we would call a Jacobin, meaning the most radical of French revolutionaries, which really makes it quite interesting and quite paradoxical that when Napoleon rises to power as first consul and then later as emperor, Jacques-Louis David is completely smitten. He says that Bonaparte is his hero, and he decides that he will go to work for Bonaparte. He becomes Bonaparte's official painter, even though he is he's incredibly against absolute power. It's this really strange paradox that art historians and historians still struggle to explain. In this painting, which was commissioned from David, Napoleon wrote that he wanted to be, quote, calm on a fiery steed, which I really love. And I think that that is exactly what's going on here. The horse rearing, going over the St. Bernard Pass, and we're reminded in the painting that the only other two leaders to go over the St. Bernard Pass were Charlemagne and Hannibal. Jacques-Louis David puts Bonaparte on a white horse, even though to get over the St. Bernard Pass, he would have been riding a mule. And there's a great painting by an artist named Delaroche that's in the Louvre that depicts Bonaparte riding a mule. It was made well after Bonaparte dies. But this was the official propaganda picture, right, that's sent out to all the courts. There's many copies of this painting. It was sent out to many courts in Europe, as Bonaparte was trying to cultivate allies in Europe at the time. So Jacques-Louis David starts representing contemporary history. And it's a really interesting turn for history painting. I'm sorry this slide is so blurry, but this is a gigantic painting, and it represents the coronation of Napoleon. It actually doesn't represent the coronation of Napoleon, it represents the coronation of Josephine. This is a masterful piece of propaganda because it doesn't represent Napoleon crowning himself emperor. Lots of people were anti-Napoleon at this time, and the whole idea of being anti-Napoleon was this problem that Napoleon had seized power, that he was a despot. Napoleon Bonaparte commissions this painting from David that represents Josephine being crowned, not Napoleon. This would have been a very problematic subject for David to have depicted, because Napoleon Bonaparte, going against all tradition for French coronations, where the Pope is the one that crowns you king, in this case emperor, Bonaparte decided that since he saw himself and wanted to be seen as a self-made man, that he would crown himself. And the Pope just sat down the whole time. The Pope was asked to do nothing. So this would have made this would have been a bad PR move for Bonaparte. Napoleon also commissions various battle paintings, and I'm showing you another student of Jacques-Louis David, and now, because I kept repeating this over and over again, you're getting the sense that Jacques-Louis David was a really big deal at this time, and he had a lot of students who were trying to emulate him and trying to achieve what he had achieved. This is one of his students, Antoine Jean Gros, who became the most important battle painter of the Napoleonic Empire. Painting the Battle of the Pyramids, Napoleon went to Egypt. He got routed there. That's a whole other story. And this is a battle painting. It's huge. It's bigger than this, actually. This one's in Versailles. But if you go to the Louvre today, you can see other battle paintings by Antoine Jean Gros, and these are basically propaganda pieces. And so this is all to say that war was really, that was the order of the day from 1792 until 1815 in France. And I think in the United States, we can relate to that a little bit, right? We are now in a period of an extended war. I think, it's not, certainly the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq are far removed, right? But at this time, it's from 1792 to 1815, the whole economy of France was based on war. And this is something that's very important, and it also gives you a sense of what happens after Waterloo, right? We're talking about a tremendous defeat, right? Where France had been elevated as being the most powerful country in the world at this time. And then after Waterloo, Napoleon's second final defeat, there is a reckoning that happens. And that's why I'm introducing you to this painting, to Jericho through this painting, The Deluge. Jericho is a very different kind of French artist. We would associate him with this very important ism, Romanticism, right? Which is a term that we use to talk about art that deals with the darker side of things, and also a form of art that deals with contemporary life. Jericho was not a member of the Academy. He was not trained in Jacques-Louis David's studio. He wasn't actually trained in anybody's studio. He was more or less self-taught. And the way that Jericho taught himself to paint is that he would go to French museums and he would copy the pictures that were on display in the museums, such as Antoine Jean Gros' Battle of the Pyramids, and that's exactly what I'm showing you here. This painting, Jericho literally floods a Napoleonic battlefield. This was, underneath this painting is a copy of Gros' Battle of the Pyramids. We think that he probably painted it, he made the copy of this picture around 1812 when he was thinking about making a battle painting, and I'll show you those in a minute. But in 1815, he realizes after Waterloo that battle pictures are not viable anymore. That's over. So if you want to be a history painter, you have to come up with something new, right? Battle painting's not going to work anymore. The empire is gone. It's dead. What do we do? And I think in many ways you can see this dark ochre, kind of strangely, people escaping the flood, crawling up on the rocks like crabs. You can see this in a way as like a mourning picture for empire. These are the pictures that Jericho first submits to the Salon, first in 1812, then in 1814. These are basically his battle paintings. And they're very, very strange battle paintings. If you think back to the Jacques-Louis David picture of Napoleon calm on the fiery steed that I showed you earlier, these paintings show us the sort of uncertain side of fighting in war, the doubtfulness of a soldier who is actually leaving the battlefield. These are anonymous soldiers. We don't know who they are. We are not being given a kind of clear narrative of heroicism, right? Napoleon Bonaparte charging over the St. Bernard Pass. And we have Jericho's wounded cuirassier who looks over his shoulder, and we have no idea what he's looking at. We're being given a fragment of a battle. And the fact that Jericho is showing us war in fragments is very interesting. It's also quite unprecedented. The other thing that we could say about this, Jericho got hammered by Salon Critics for the anatomy, for the kind of lumpy legs here. And he was quite devastated by this. Jacques-Louis David, though, saw this painting in 1814, went to the Salon, saw the painting, and said, "Who is this? I don't know the hand who made this." Jacques-Louis David recognized that there was some kind of energy in this picture that he hadn't seen before, because what we're looking at here is an artist who was not trained in the neoclassical, rigorous academic system that Jacques-Louis David was trained in. He's learning it on his own. After 1814, when Jericho is humiliated by Salon Critics who just castigate him for these strange paintings that are not heroic, and by the way, I should also say that at the time that Jericho paints these in 1812 and in 1814, the empire, Napoleon's empire, is starting to crumble. 1812 is when Napoleon is getting routed in Russia. 1814 is the so-called Battle of France, when the Allies are literally in Paris, marching on the Champs-Élysées. That's the first time Napoleon falls from power. So already Jericho is taking stock of the crumbling of empire. In 1814, after being humiliated with his Salon exhibitions, Jericho goes to Italy. And unlike Jacques-Louis David, who had his whole trip to Italy financed by the French government after winning the Rome Prize, Jericho pays his own way. You know, and even though that costs him a lot of money, that affords him a kind of freedom to go to the museums he wants to go to study the masters that he wants to study. And instead of studying the classics and studying ancient art, Jericho is more interested in 16th and 17th century Italian art, what we would call Baroque, which is darker, has this kind of vivacious painterly energy that Jericho is really interested in. And he comes back to France in 1817. So he's there for about 2.5 years. And he's a much better painter when he comes back. He understands better how to paint the body and form in general. He's also more interested in shadow when he comes back from Italy. And he doesn't have a lot of money at this time. So he cannot afford to hire live models. So he has to paint the things that are around him. And this is a great example of this. I think this is one of the most stunning paintings ever made. It's a very small picture. It's in the Louvre. It's about this big, portrait of a lioness. He went to the zoo, the Jardin des Plantes, and he observed the lioness. And, you know, Jericho did not paint women. And he painted animals, right? He was interested in passion, but not necessarily a kind of gendered passion. He was interested in sort of representing non-rational thought, and animals are a really interesting way into that. And of course, you know, I've never seen a more kind of sensitive portrayal of a lioness, and then the horse. I mean, this horse is beautiful, right? And when I think of this, what I see here is a kind of libidinal energy in this horse. And I think it's undeniable. This horse has a subjectivity, right? You are looking into the eyes of a living, breathing animal that has feelings. And Jericho is able to represent that, to bring this horse into portraiture and give us what I think is one of the best horse portraits I've ever seen. Jericho also picks up the new medium of the day, which is lithography, which comes into France after the fall of Napoleon. Jericho is interested in how you represent defeat without representing defeat in a battle. How do you turn defeat into a metaphor? And this, I think, is another, I mean, he does really great things with animals. Dead Horse, which is most certainly an allusion to the retreat from Russia in the winter of 1812 and 1813, because over 500,000 horses died on that retreat. And Jericho was, of course, very sensitive to horse anatomy and just what horses meant. Horses were, of course, at the time, the weapons of mass destruction of those wars. And here, treated very sensitively, bloated, dead, frozen. Jericho also uses lithography to think about people, to think about soldiers. In the case of these two lithographs, we have this one at the Hood Museum, which is really exciting. In the case of these two lithographs, again, we're back to this anonymous figure of the soldier, right, without a kind of clear identity. And of course, you know, something I haven't talked about much is this question, which was the most central question of the French Revolution. What should we do with hierarchy? How do we deal with hierarchy in society? Is it through merit or is it through birth, right? How do we establish rank in society? Should you earn it or should it be conferred by noble birth? And of course, with this lithograph, what's really interesting in terms of the literal hierarchy of the space is that it is the wounded who are at the top of the picture, the most able-bodied at the bottom. Jericho is interested in thinking about questions of hierarchy. And we'll talk about that when we now approach this picture, the Raft of the Medusa, exhibited at the Salon of 1819. He finances it on his own. He saves up money. He orders a giant canvas. And this is Jericho's only history painting, because he dies tragically young in 1824 after a horse riding accident. This is his only epic picture, and so it's great that we have it. It also makes me really sad that he died so young at the age of 33, so that we didn't get to see where he would have gone from this. This painting is larger than you're seeing it up here. It's much larger, actually. When you see this painting in person, you almost get a sense of vertigo that things might be collapsing on you a little bit. Jericho was in search of a subject that would revolutionize history painting. He wanted to leave his mark, much like Jacques-Louis David did with the Oath of the Horatii, by choosing his own subject, by enlarging the picture, by sending it 2 weeks late. Jericho understood that the way that you leave your mark in French art at this time is you exhibit a history painting at the Salon. But in order to make your mark, the subject has to be really daring. This is a very daring subject. It's a very dark subject. I should also say, and this harkens back to my timeline at the very beginning, that after 1815, France has a new government after Napoleon falls. It's the so-called Bourbon Restoration. And the Bourbons, and by the way, Louis XVI, Louis XV, Louis XIV, they were Bourbons. The Bourbon government is restored in France after 1815. This is such a strange irony that after, the regicide of Louis XVI, we get the Bourbons again in 1815. So we have a royalist government at this time. That's a very important piece of context for understanding this painting. This painting represented a contemporary event, a shipwreck off the coast of Senegal. So a true story. So already, Jericho is breaking the rules by representing a contemporary subject. This was a sensational event. This was a little bit like the Titanic of its day, but much, much darker. And I will tell you why. So Jericho was a reader, an avid reader of newspapers at the time. And what was being discussed in newspapers at the time was the shipwreck of the Medusa, which was a large ship that was sailing down to Senegal to reestablish a French colony in Senegal. Senegal was a French colony since the 18th century, and then it was lost during the Napoleonic Wars, and then the Allies decided to give it back to France as part of the peace treaty. So this ship that's sailing down to Senegal in 1817 carries on it lots of equipment for sort of starting farms down there. This was supposed to be an agricultural colony, as well as bourgeois farmers who wanted to set up shop there, and labor in the form of mercenary soldiers who had actually fought in the Napoleonic Wars. They were known as the Colonial Brigade. They were soldiers that were mercenary fighters from all of France's colonies. They were regarded as being the so-called dregs of the French army at the time. And since the French army was effectively disbanded after 1815, they needed new jobs. So this was a job that they went on, sailing down to Senegal. The captain, and this was a government-sponsored ship, the captain of the ship, of the Medusa, that's the name of the ship, was grossly incompetent. And the only reason he was the captain of this ship is because his family was very good friends with the Bourbon king. Right? So it's this question of how is rank conferred in the wake of the French Revolution. During the Bourbon Restoration, it was conferred through noble birth, right? Getting away from those ideals, those egalitarian ideals of the French Revolution. So the ship gets grounded founders on a coral reef off the coast of Senegal, and it starts sinking. Just like in Titanic, there are only a few lifeboats. And of course, just like in Titanic, all the wealthy people get on the lifeboats, right? It's the officers, most of the officers, the captain of the ship, anyone who was an aristocrat, and some of the bourgeois sort of farmers got on the lifeboats. And 160 very unlucky people, most of whom were these colonial mercenary soldiers, had to fend for themselves on a raft that they constructed with spare kind of wood found on the Medusa. The raft measured about 13 by 30 feet. We're talking about 160 people. We think there was one woman among the people on the raft. And of course, the captain and his cronies in the lifeboat, the deal was that they would tow the raft, right, with a rope. But of course, as soon as they get out on the water, what happens? Exactly. The rope is cut, the raft drifts, see you later, we'll never see you again. But what ends up happening is that 5 people of the 160 end up surviving. And it should not surprise you to know that the people who end up surviving on the raft are the officers. The mercenary soldiers, nobody survives of the mercenary soldiers, and we'll talk about that. So Jericho chooses this really sensational story, and what makes it really sensational is the fact that eventually these people are rescued, but only 13 days after they've been drifting. And maybe some of you can see that here. There's a little gray blip on the horizon. That is the rescue ship, the Argus. So what Jericho is representing is the moment of the rescue. But the reason why this was a really sensational story, it wasn't just this kind of class difference. It wasn't the gross incompetence of the captain. It was the cannibalism that made this a really sensational story. On the third night, the soldiers, the mercenary soldiers, resort to cannibalism. They eat cooked human flesh. The officers wait until the fourth night. Now, the reason why we know this is because there was a tell-all book written by two of these officers whose names are Corillard and Savigny. And they are the officers who author this multi-volume book. It's a bestseller in France. It's published in multiple editions between 1817 and 1821. Jericho has a copy of it. We have the copy in the Louvre. We see that Jericho has made drawings of nudes on the back of some of the pages, so he's really invested in this story. Corillard and Savigny write about the cannibalism, which is of course picked up by all the newspapers. Jericho realizes that this is a story which will make a great history painting. But cannibalism doesn't really work as the subject for a history painting. But Jericho thinks about this, and he asks himself, if cannibalism is part of the story, how will it feature in a history painting? Because you can't really represent in a history painting someone taking a bite out of someone else. That just doesn't work. And the way that Jericho composes his picture is that he starts making studies. And we have about 24 oil studies that he uses to compose the Raft of the Medusa, which is he's composing it in a very different way than someone like Jacques-Louis David, who conceptualizes his whole composition, drafts it out on paper, and then transfers it to a canvas. What Jericho does is he works through the narrative as he's making the picture. And this is the one study we have where someone's taking a bite out of someone else, the cannibal here, right? But this doesn't work in history painting. It's too graphic. It doesn't work. And what Jericho does is he sort of turns the raft around as he's composing it. And the cannibal who's taking a bite out of this poor guy right here gets shifted. All right, and most of these are in the Louvre. So the cannibal here shifts direction and becomes part of the body clump that is responsible for the rescue of the ship. To compose his picture, and like I said, Jericho really couldn't afford live models. He didn't have a lot of money. Jericho goes to the morgue, and he gets spare body parts of criminals and of people. People were just always falling into the Seine and killing themselves in the Seine, and there were spare body parts at the morgue, and they were free. And Jericho brings them to his studio to study what rotting flesh looks like. I mean, this is a pretty incredible thing to do as a history painter when the only model you have for history painting is classical, pristine, pink, fleshy bodies of ancient warriors. But Jericho decides that his history painting is going to be about decaying bodies. It's a rather incredible decision. Now, this painting really gets me because what I find really interesting about this painting is if you forget for a moment what you're looking at, what you actually see here is a kind of tender embrace, right? You see a tender embrace of hand and foot, and then you fall back and you realize, oh my gosh, what am I looking at? And there's a kind of repulsion. And this painting plays with you, I think, in terms of the attractiveness of an embrace, but the repulsion of the body as flesh. The other thing about body as flesh is that it's the great equalizer. There is no rank here. There is no hierarchy, right? It is just flesh. Jericho is thinking about this. In 1812, a German anthropologist writes about cannibalism, and I should say the Europeans were kind of obsessed with cannibalism at this point, because this is the era of overseas exploration. They don't know what they're gonna find, right? And all these Europeans who are exploring are writing about cannibalism, and this German writing about cannibalism in 1812 claims that the most delicious part of the body is the interior of the palm and the sort of foot and the interior of your foot, the bottom side of your foot. So it's interesting to me that Jericho chooses this. But these are studies for the Raft of the Medusa. He also goes into hospitals and he draws emaciated people. So he's very invested in making his painting as true to life as possible. Right? He doesn't want to bend the truth. He wants to show it as horrifying as it really is. What's really interesting about this painting, and I'll come over here to read this. What's really interesting about this painting is, of course, the way that Salon Critics respond to it. And maybe you all have seen that, one of the choices that Jericho makes in this painting is to put somebody who would normally be on the bottom of the social hierarchy, a black man, a mercenary, a soldier, at the bottom of the social hierarchy, puts him on the top of his pyramid. He's inverting this person's status in society by putting them on top of this pyramid here. What's really interesting about this painting is the Salon Critics read it as being monochromatic. They do not see the black man. They do not talk about the black man. And this is so interesting because what that tells you is that vision is so ideological. What we see is a function of what we know and our values. These Salon Critics are so great that I just have to read some of these for you. Painting, what do you want of me? There is not one episode to respond to my desire, and always my spirit returns to my first impression of the disturbance presented by persons heaped between life and death, without color, without character, and almost all touched by an anticipated corruption. And what that critic is talking about is cannibalism, an anticipated corruption. Something is amiss here. The critics are repulsed by the passivity of this painting. They see it as being monochromatic, which is really strange. And this one's really great too. The artist does not believe it necessary to mark either the nationality or the status of these figures. Are they Greeks or Romans? Are they Turks or Frenchmen? Who are these people? Right? These critics do not identify with the people being represented in this painting. What is a Frenchman after the French Revolution? What does that look like? Jericho cannot represent cannibalism in his painting because cannibalism is unspeakable. So instead of actually representing cannibalism, what Jericho does is that he finds ways to barely suggest it. And this creates this kind of horror for Salon critics looking at this painting who don't see a heroic center in this painting. They want a story that they understand, that's clear. This painting is not giving it to them. Instead, it is suggesting some kind of violence that's already happened, and this is my favorite part where Jericho does this. We have the axe. If the slide were a little better, you would see that that is a kind of dark red, brown paint on the surface of that axe, suggesting that that axe has been used to chop body parts. So he can't directly show it. He can just allude to what that critic calls the anticipated corruption. You'll also notice that in this painting, there are lots of stumps. There are lots of body parts that are cut off, that are cropped. And also, this right here should be readable to you in relationship to the fragment study that I showed you. Right? That's how Jericho is sort of playing on the questions of bodies intermingling with each other. And of course, for Jericho, this charge of black intermingling with a white body that the critics don't see. They call it colorless. This is one of my favorite parts of stumps in the picture. This is a very calculated move right here. The sheath over the foot, disguising maybe an absence, maybe a presence. where is this man's body? Where is the rest of the foot? Is it going into the background, or is it really there? These ambiguities are what give this picture its charge. And of course, the man at the top of the pyramid. This is a man named Joseph, who is actually a very popular model, one of the very few models that Jericho hired. And Joseph was a popular model among painters at the time. And what Jericho has done is, of course, given him this object in his hand. Joseph is the one that is responsible for hailing the ship in the distance that will be the rescue ship. Jericho gives Joseph this job to do, this very important rank in this painting, which Joseph would not be accorded normally in everyday contemporary French life. This is a tattered French flag, and I should go back and show you that the tattered French flag is all over this painting. It's in bits and pieces. It's over here, the tricolor flag. Right? This is a literal kind of taking apart of the French body politic, calling into question of what is France today. Here, it's at a loss. Right? This, for me, is a very pessimistic picture that, in a way, describes the fissures in society. It's also a painting about contemporary life, which is why it's such an important painting. It's really one of the first history paintings that represents a contemporary news event, which is very interesting. And it's also using history painting in a way against itself to teach France a contemporary lesson about itself using contemporary life. And some of these paintings were actually discovered 50 years after Jericho dies. They are his portraits of the insane. And this is what he does right after the Raft of the Medusa. There's a whole series of them. And this was actually a very common psychiatric problem after Waterloo. Men would hallucinate delusions of military grandeur and pretend that they were Napoleon. And this was a kind of social ill at the time. The last thing, I'll bring you this painting because it's at the Met, and maybe some of you can go look at it. It was painted by Jericho's very good friend, Filene, who is just as important of an artist as Jericho was, though we haven't heard very much of him today. I'm trying to change that. And this is Vernet's really sensitive portrait of Jericho after he's fallen off of his horse. And this is the illness that will lead to Jericho's death in 1824. So this is right before he dies. So, I know that this is a kind of pessimistic, kind of sad lecture, but I also feel like this is one of the most interesting paintings that's ever been made in French art history. So thank you for letting me go on to you today.